societies are extremely complex. And what Dr. Kumar said just now about these frameworks of standardization, integration, personalization, we are now going to be talking about fairness. And I suppose that you can map fairness into the democratization, inclusion, and trust paradigms. Now, the racial, cultural, geographical differences around the globe, as we all know, and the lack of curated data makes fairness in technology a huge challenge. We just spoke about languages as well. We have a situation where some languages that are not spoken by many people, relatively speaking, are getting more attention than many large languages which have millions and millions of speakers. So that's also incorporates fairness. So the whole issue of machine learning, specifically in fairness in machine learning, is forcing corporations to establish this kind of ecosystem of fairer ML practice. And that is, of course, much needed. Machine learning, after all, has garnered a reputation for being a bit of a black box over the years. And to talk about this, I would like to invite the consulting editor of Boom, Raghavan Srinivasan. He's a former editor of the Business Line, the Hindu Business Line, and he's going to be moderating the session on building ML systems for fairness at scale. And also welcome on stage the people he will be speaking to. We have Luca Massaron. Luca is a data sciences expert and an author with his expertise in the field of data sciences. Specifically, he's authored over 10 books about data science, machine learning, deep learning, and AI. He's also a lecturer of marketing and statistics and has been a part of several tech meetups and conferences. We also have with us Nikhil Bhaskaran. Nikhil is the founder of Shunya OS. He's an entrepreneur, a startup and tech community builder who believes in the large-scale benefits of community building.
Thank you, Venkatesh. And in fact, thank you once again, because your previous session actually offered an excellent segue into this session. It sort of set the framework and context for some of the discussion I hope will happen during the next 45 minutes that we have on this with this panel. And it also sort of raised or flagged critical issues, I think, which are being faced by the entire community of developers in the AI ecosystem, AI machine learning ecosystem. You know, the question of fairness always comes up whenever you're talking about data ethics. And you know, there are certain fundamental issues with all such systems. When you actually move from the lab or the development stage into the real world, that's because whatever you build, whatever kind of model, algorithm, system that you're building, you are using basically backward-looking data, historical data, to develop the model and train it, right? But the model itself is going forward into the future. And once it starts interacting with the environment, with different users in different cultural, social, economic contexts, there is no data for the algorithm to fall back on. It has to, so then you have issues of whether, the right decisions are being taken up. And we've had a number of, I think, landmark cases in the past, not so distant past. Listen, it's a new field, so you can't go back too far back in history to come up with instances. But there are a few examples which created a lot of debate about the whole question of machine learning and fairness and data ethics when they happened. One good example that I can think of is when Amazon started its same-day delivery service, and then it was found that basically their system tended to skip all inner city areas in the US, predominantly black neighborhoods, less economically depressed neighborhoods, and this service was simply not on offer there. What reason? Well, they figured it out, they fixed it later, but how did that happen? I think that's a good case study to understand what can potentially go wrong. There was this, and of course, there are multiple examples of AI-based, ML-based systems being used in law enforcement, for instance. Again, in the US context, because that's the one which is which has sort of adopted these technologies. That's the country which has adopted these technologies most widely in practice. And therefore, there are a number of examples coming up in the American context. But again, in law enforcement, most of these systems were found to have a clear racial and ethnic bias, right? So if you were black, you were tagged high risk as a potential repeat offender, whether or not whatever your first offense which brought you into the attention of the system was even an actual offense. So guilty or not, that was for the legal system to judge, but you were already judged and put into a box by the algorithm. So these are challenges, and I think we were these are some of the issues that we would like to look at when you're. So how do you solve this problem? For instance, how do you sort of, can you create a system or a model to sort of automate this process of, developers cannot keep on going back and reworking the model. It's not possible in the real world. So how do we build systems which sort of have automated fairness checkers built into them, for instance, evaluations? How do we do automated course corrections? I think these are, some of the broad challenges which the entire AI community, developer community is still grappling with. So we will talk about these issues at length, but what I would like to do to start with is to perhaps invite the two panelists to share their initial thoughts for 8 or 10 minutes each, how you see the issue, where you think the challenges lie, and where which way do you think potential solutions are being developed right now, and which way they could be developed, right? So the broad contours of this. May I first invite Mr. Luca Massaron to share his thoughts, and then I will come to you, Nikhil, and then we'll go into a sort of interactive session. It would be great, actually, if I'm not the only person asking all the questions. It would be wonderful. You could even ask each other questions, because you're really, Mr. Massaron has not just written the book on the subject, he's written 10 books on the subject, right? So I'm not the expert out here. So it'd be great to sort of share your insights as the session develops. So over to you, Mr. Massaron.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you can hear me well. And I would like to start with a consideration. So much has happened in artificial intelligence and machine learning in the recent years. Actually, I have some experience, apart from writing books, which are divulgative, in insurance and banking. And I remember how our focus just 5 years ago was more on privacy matters than on equity or fairness. Why? Because of legislation pressure, and because, of course, it was a very important matter for companies implementing their systems. At that times, if you didn't treat with privacy in the correct way, you could have fines, and no matter how performing your automation by machine learning AI were, you could not gain from them if you failed at dealing with privacy. At that time, when we went into our database, we realized that databases were thought for a completely different purpose. They were not implemented correctly from the privacy point of view. So our approach was, yes, to control when we implemented the system. So to create, self-controlling automation that could provide us hints if something was not going wrong. For example, if certain customers in our databases were still be dealt with in spite of the fact that they opted out of certain programs or the fact of being treated. But apart from that ex post controls, the most important intervention that we did at that time was that to design privacy since the beginning. There is one important mainstream action called privacy by design that you can implement since the early start of a project by redefining how the data is collected, how the data is treated, how the data will impact on the models and the application you're going to create. I see now for fairness the same situation. We have started first realizing the need of being fair because thanks to public opinion, thanks to investigating journalism, we found out that many applications like the Compass, for example, in US, were a failure because actually they didn't predict correctly. They predict correctly for a majority or in a global sense. But when you went to see about minorities, about certain groups, you felt that they were not providing the correct prediction, and they were creating by enforcing and reenacting inequalities and unfairness. So, of course, we realized the problem, so we started immediately to implement a lot of checks. We started by checking, for example, algorithm bias, because algorithm themselves can create a different, kind of prediction for different groups. So it can work perfectly well for the majority, but for minorities, they can create fallacies. They can create predictions that are really not fit. And we created automatic systems. So when we are implementing our models, we control for the performances, we control that we don't have concept drift, so we are always a good fit for the problem they should be solving, but also we also monitor for consistencies of predictions across sensible groups, because we know what are sensible groups based on distinction of gender, nationality, ethnicity, for example, income, or other sensible information that we have. But that's not enough, because actually these systems change continuously and are tested against unexpected information, unexpected data that we are training not with. So we had to rethink all the process since the beginning, the kind of data we are collecting. Is it suitable for implementing a fair system, a system that is not enacted inequality and unfairness? So what can we do? Should we collect all the information? Should we collect all the information that is needed for checking, and that's all? So we are thinking about processes now, and this is where I think in the future, in the near future, the fairness discourse will focus more on processes of enacting correctly, the process of having a fair system enacted, than just automating or just thinking about scaling. Scaling is an important method that we should discuss in this discussion of ours.
Nikhil, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll start by putting the whole thing in perspective. I think why this session is important and why discussing this is so important. Bias or all this incorrect, whatever comes into the AI model is coming from the society. So the thing is timing. What do we have as humanity? What is that we have right now? Is a chance to correct it. A lot of decision, if you see even at, let me just give you a random example and nothing. So, some HR has got a lot of experience, and sometimes even the gender, might bias. When you see that someone on Zoom, just seeing gender might bias the person, that this is not suited for it, or you might not look through the whole skills. Now, when you move this kind of system to the AI, you can avoid feeding it the parameters of gender. That particular job does not have. So that means a lot of decision making is changing from traditional humans to machines. And this is once in a lifetime opportunity where we can set it fair. But like Luca was saying, will people naturally set it fair? No. I mean, entropy is at work, there's lack of energy to take up all these challenges. So typically it is going to descend into disorder. The same problems that existed in the physical world would, in a natural course of time, come into the metaverse. The digital universe would become a replica or maybe an amplified replica of these social problems. But here decisions like this become so important, because at least largely wherever there is democracy, and these are countries that are driving most of the, at least largely we can control only these countries. The public opinion shapes the course. Like when privacy became so important for the public, people started realizing that this is what is happening. And that's where investigative journalism, journalists become so important, because once you make the public aware, people sit up and think, are we doing enough about it? If there is not enough awareness, it's going to pass. People are not going to bother about these parameters. So the timing is very important. This is the timing when most of the models are getting created, deployed. At this time, if there is right noise and it comes on top of the agenda, typically the engineer himself does not have it as on his agenda. I'll be very honest, and I'll tell you, humanly, it's not. Sometimes to be, I don't know if I'm being wrong here, but sometimes when I myself as an engineer deal with challenges, you're bogged down by so many technical challenges, you tend to miss that point, unless it's so much important from the social side that when you sit on the table, you also know, no, this is important, critical. I cannot. So that's why making noise in the society, making people aware how critical is this issue, is very important. Then I will come down to how technically this can be done. Obviously, there are many ways you can do it. Like I said, one of the examples would be general awareness that AI depends on the parameters that you feed it to. It learns those parameters. So what parameters is what the society can tell the engineer, that when you are doing this particular decision making, only these parameters should be considered in a fair environment. So should you be capturing, like you said, we have gone insanely crazy about data. We keep capturing every single data point, and and then, but there is something in between. Even if you have captured all of that data, you don't have to all of that AI. It might end up the same place. For this particular decision making that you're designing this AI, how much of that data should you give to this AI? How much do you want the machine to know? These are parameters that you can control. So from high level of importance of timing to what can be done at the AI level, I've just tried to give a quick brush. I think this will trigger the discussion. I hope so. And then you can carry it.
Yes, thanks. I think, one common thread that I find in both of your opening remarks is that, bias is part of the system. Bias exists in society, bias exists in the data that you're feeding into the model, bias exists in the engineers who are building these systems, right? Each individual is unique and different and has a different worldview, different different parameters for judging things, right? and there are systemic biases as well, and all of these biases, it's a given that they get built into systems. The point is, how do we build or how do we develop tools or mechanisms which either mitigate or eliminate these biases, or at least check, and give you an alert that, hey, there is something going wrong out here, there is a bias out here. And the problem becomes even more complex when you look at more complexly layered and structured societies. India is a very good example of that. We have 22 official languages, right? So huge diversity in terms of people. We also have something which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, which is something called a caste system, but which, as every Indian knows, deeply affects, who we are, what we are, how well we do in our lives, the kind of opportunities that we are given. All this is also informed by your caste, but that is something which is simply not captured in any data system. Our last caste census was done in the 1930s. So we don't have enough data to go by, but we know that this is a factor which brings in heavy bias into human decision making. And if you're trying to develop ML systems or AI systems which sort of replace that or build on that, these biases are going to get inbuilt. So the first challenge, I think, is in actually just bias detection. How do we build tools that can detect inherent biases within a system, and how do we sort of automate this process? So because the model is also evolving, right? That's a basis That's a fundamental definition of an AI system. So it's also evolving as it grows. So how do we correct it as we go on? Any of you would like to go first? It's open to both panelists.
Nikhil, thank you. I have an example that I like to always illustrate because it matches perfectly with actually what you told us just about data and how these affect biases from all sources that you can control actually. In insurance, we have often this problem of pricing for cars. In European countries, since a long time, we notice it a bias in gender, but is unexpectedly, but not so unexpectedly, males usually drive more badly than females. So they cause more accidents, so they're more expensive to insurance. So tendentially, we would prefer to, price higher insurance for males than for females, but this is discriminatory. So the solution was just to suppress. This is a technique. You suppress the variable. You build models without that variables that you think is discriminating. But actually, the point is that the fact that a driver is a male or female comes back in many, many ways that you cannot expect. For example, if someone decided to put the color of a car inside their model, that can discriminate, because we notice that certain types of car, models, colors are more typically of a certain gender than the other. So the point is, no matter what we do, biases will always leak inside our models. So the first thing is we have to be aware of biases. The second thing to create fair system is to know that we can have trade-offs, but we can never create a perfect fair system. First of all, because we always aim at performance, right? If we are making a model for credit rating or for pricing an insurance offer, actually we aim, of course, at bringing advantage to our organization. So we have a first constraint. Then we have adjunct constraints related to fairness. So for example, to protect certain groups. And we can have different, of course, objectives, because in terms of fairness, you can see it at multiple levels. For example, you can see it as, for example, preventing people not entering inside, for example, a positive group if they are not meant to, or, of course, to allow people who would be barred from algorithm from entering to enter instead. And these that are both fair aims actually are contrasting if you are working in model, site point of view. So as I was implying, it's a very difficult work, and it doesn't end with algorithms. It also starts with society pointing out what you should do in terms of fairness. So organizations, individuals have biases and purposes. Algorithm can enhance the biases that we have in data and in society. But the point is, we can, mitigate this by various tools, but it's always not enough. When you repair one part, another part will, of course, emerge as problematic. We should have a framework. We should have an objective that is provided us by government, by legislation, that says you should trade your objectives in order to achieve this. So only in this case, we will, head with a strong willingness and strong technicalities toward a fair solution, in my opinion. What do you think, Nikhil?
Yeah, thanks for that, Luca. Shinasan, do you want to say something before I come in?
No. In fact, I was going to ask you that, and also sort of, I think, the other thing, which strikes me very strongly is how much our own individual perspectives shape what we do. For instance, Luca comes from a European perspective. The idea of Europe is actually predicated on fairness. The European Union was created as an artificial construct post-war to create a sort of rule-based system which treats people equally and fairly, gives everyone a say. So it's a very, very fundamental to the European way of thinking. India is quite different. So how do you see the differences happening out here in terms of the kind of society that we are, the kind of thinking that has shaped us, and how is that impacting on the work that is happening here? That's another dimension I would like to tack on to Luca's question to you.
Okay, I'll start from the original point that you asked about the tools, right? What tools can we do so that these biases are removed? And then you said, how it impacts from which society you're coming in. And obviously that's how we are all biased somewhere, because they're only, and it's just clear from in AI terms when I speak, I'm biased because there's a certain data set I'm exposed to in my lifetime. My decisions are based on the data set that I'm exposed to. And human decision making is exactly the same. We are biased because we see a certain environment, and we have access to only a certain kinds of environment that we have lived, experienced, and we have not experienced it all. That's where human biases creep in. When people come from a certain remote village, and speaking of the caste example, they grow up in an environment where caste was very important for them. They grow in that environment where people were treating like that. All that was fed into their data, and their decision making goes exactly the same way. So human biases also creep from the same point that we are all that weak as humans, that we don't get exposure to the entire functioning of the world. So biases do exist from the place that you come in. Taking the first part of the question, tools. So now, when you speak of the tools, first is detect. You also asked about detecting the biases. Now, detecting in itself is a huge task, because usually what the bias would be is about underrepresented, areas and communities which normally would lose sight. So that means you need to have someone in the leadership, or the framework itself should be, what are the outliers and what are the other things that we have not factored in before we deploy this model. Because so those are the checks and balances. Like you before you do a rollout, you do your QC. So the QC has to have these parameters. So the QC tool needs to be improved and say that what are the underrepresented areas that is not represented in the data that we have fed. And so from the society, like suppose, again going back to the, sorry Lucas, I don't know if you know the Indian caste system, because a certain, we even figure out the biases are so ingrained that by our name kind of build an impression about the person even before we meet, because we kind of put them into a bucket. Okay, he's from this side, and that's how a lot of decision gets made. People work with only certain surnames and certain last names, and they have communities within that makes them easy. So on the tool side, what you need is whatever happens in the society, that is going to happen largely in this case also, for most of these common applications. So your tool needs to say that what is happening. Have you factored for all this right now? Have you put all those use cases, margin use cases, and tested them against them before we roll out? And these must become an important step before it's rolled out. You cannot roll out, because during the data, maybe they will complain that I did not get enough data, that's why it happened, but that's a different case. So the QC has a completely different angle. My company, my organization has to be fair. As an early adopter, as a rollout as a company, whoever is rolling out new technology also has leadership on him. Like Bill Gates said, with more power comes more responsibility. You got the power of AI first, you also are more responsible in the shape of the society that you would bring in. So these tools need to be enforced. One part, obviously, then the data side tools can also see that these marginal classes are included in the data, but I think it will happen from the QC side and go back practically running engineering teams for a very long period of time. This is what I think will happen practically. The other way around does not happen so much in engineering teams. So it comes back from the QC is one way, and then the second part of the societies that we come from, I kind of answered that it is because, again, the AI parlance, because that's all we have seen. So our decision making will mirror what we are exposed to in our lives. And Europe, the discussion is around all these topics. So the brain is fed with all those parameters, and each of the discussions they're thinking and talking about it. So it's used to it. It's used to thinking in those frames. Generally, we are not used to. We have different challenges that probably occupy our time. How do I make money? How do I pay my EMI? Or in a developing country, a lot of focus goes on these primary stuff, and that's what again, I'm for repeating, it's investigative journalism, it's mass media that has that power to take these emerging issues and bring them into the society, into discussion. This is the power that media holds. They can bring any topic into discussion. Otherwise, people are going to just be busy with their normal stuff. So, in certain societies like ours, this is not going to come up for discussion so much. So, the background. So, how do we go into a fair world in future? By avoiding these things that we have in our physical worlds, is what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sort of raises another point, and that is basically you very you made an eloquent point about the need for public discussion and understanding and debate. That's how you evolve some of these as you go along. But there is also the regulatory aspect, because this is not something which the developer community is doing in isolation. There are lots of other stakeholders involved. There are the corporations which are basically you're developing these systems for. They have their own stakeholder ecosystem. Then you have the government, which is plays a different role out here, and regulators and lawmakers. To start with, have very poor understanding of this, but so they are applying their existing biases when it comes to framing regulation for this, and then there is, of course, the technology itself. For instance, Luca, you mentioned that in developing certain systems, say in insurance or finance, you deliberately say omit gender, right? Because you felt that this sort of tends to bias certain outcomes. But this can also be a regulatory requirement. Regulators, because of data privacy requirements, might say that you cannot include age or gender data in this. But that's a simple problem for an engineer to solve. They will use other data points to reverse engineer and fingerprint the gender or the approximate and fairly accurate age group of the user, right? So that's an engineering problem which they solve in their sleep. So you got around the regulation. So we have to also look at what is the meaning and intent of the regulation and not the regulation per se, and how do we incorporate that into building systems. There is the other challenge, and I think that's a broader issue, I feel, for this entire tech community. I find, for instance, and I speak only from an Indian context out here, I find that by and large, the tech community tends to sort of ignore most of the other social upheavals and forces which are happening in the society around them. They're focused on the job at hand, their tasks, their challenges, but they're not really looking at, okay, yes, and they are all citizens, so probably they go out and vote, but other than that, they're not engaged in these kind of social debates, which are also shaping views and opinion, and also creating fresh biases, modifying earlier ones. So how do we also make the community? You talked about the role of media, but media can only play a certain part. Media can put the information out, but that information has to be consumed. And that's been my personal experience. I spent 30-40 years in journalism, and this is one particular community I found always difficult to address, because they're so inward looking. So unless I'm talking about something which interests them directly, they just tune out. And they're also very busy people. They tend to be very, very, intense workers, and that tends to sort of overwhelm other things, the other inputs that come into their lives. So, how do we fix this, Luca? I think you had mentioned the need for sort of education itself. How do we sort of build this into training of engineers? So it becomes part of the thinking process. This is something which is automatically included. And if it is a factor which is being considered ab initio, then it's not a problem you're solving after you hit a problem. But it's, you already designed a solution within the model. So how do we do that?
Yes, actually, I really agree. Everywhere, tech communities are very focused on what we are doing. And in this high specialization, which is required because the field is running so fast, the technology is expanding at a very high speed, you really cannot keep pace with other parts of society. And sometimes you just focus narrowly on what you are doing and on striving for excellence in it. But of course, it's a balance. Technology is just one part of society, of our very highly specialized society. So one thing that I noticed it as a requirement is that in education for technological people, we need a more humanistic approach. We need, to also illustrate ethics thematics, how technology impacts society. We need, to teach people that they can look at problems also under different perspectives. And this is very important because I cannot see in any program this part is still, something that is overlooked by many data science and engineering programs. And I will add another, instead, very practical experience of mine in my work is okay, technology and tech people are very focused only on certain problems. So why don't we create interdisciplinary teams? Teams where tech people work together with people of different formation. For example, people having expertise on politics or on sociology. That will definitely help, for example, in implementing better systems, striving for technologically excellence, but also for fairness, for example, and for having a positive impact. Because what we do in the end, if it doesn't have a positive impact in society, is really meaningless.
Yes, Nikhil, I would like to you to build a little also on this in the Indian context. In India, as you know, we are very good at solving immediate problems. So, if you take the tech industry, maybe 20 years ago, there was a huge shortage of just basically computer engineers, and the industry solved that problem very, very quickly. The education sector, hundreds, thousands of institutions sprang up, and we started producing coding engineers on an assembly line basis, and that is now beginning to happen with AI. I know for a fact that there are at least half a dozen institutions in India which are already offering a bachelor's level degree in AI, right? But are these, have you been involved in discussions around what kind of curriculum that we should have? How do we this thing, because we can talk about building the tools, but how do we train the builders of tools? I think that's an issue that needs to be looked at as well. What do you think?
Yeah, so I've been involved in shaping curriculum for AI for multiple engineering colleges. I would say that Indians are solving problems. What we are very good at solving and what gets our maximum focus is money. The moment we lose our profits on money, that becomes an important problem. So when the human labor problem that was solved, like we didn't have enough engineers, it was affecting their bottom line directly. They were not, because it was a service industry, they get paid by showing the number of seats they could fill. So you are doing a per seat billing. So the more number of people that you can bring into the organization, the more money you make. So money makes that problem on priority. You know, then despite that becoming important, so whenever people are going towards AI, if you ask most of them, they would say that's because I can make more money if I have an AI skill. So in a developing country, because most of the time you're judged, again, that is a bias coming from the society, that you're judged based on the money wealth that you have, and the talk that happens, the glorification of multi-million dollar valuations and all of that, and so obviously everyone inside internally seeks validation in the society, that where do I stand in this whole humanity, what is my space, and everyone's still a child that's discovering its space. So when the society is rewarding money and money is more in AI and not being fair, I don't know how do you get this human to prioritize fairness. So that's why I still think it's more of the leadership and the people who control the mass, the agenda, what discussions come on scale. From once fairness starts coming there, tech it will automatically drill down into the technology teams. Again, Lucas made a very interesting point, and I would think that is where it would go, because practically speaking, see, one thing I'll be fair, when you come into a tech team, you'll really realize why it is not possible. A techie is not always a bad guy. He's a good guy. Why is it? You might think it's his job to be fair, equally fair when he's building technology, but practically, fields are getting highly specialized, highly complex. It is actually getting beyond your mind's power to even solve that as a person. You need multiple people solving the technology piece itself. So I'll go back to Lucas where he said, the important thing is now you need to understand we are going towards a very complex solution world where all of this will teams. All of good products will come from good diverse teams where the team as a whole has all these things in the team. That is, there's a person who's focusing on fairness, there's a person who's focusing on technology, there's a person focusing on profitability. So from a high level, the agenda to be driven is how do we get the fairness guys into the team? And not just the tech guys and the management who's focused on profitability, discussing how should our AI solution be designed. Because as leaders, we have this responsible that whatever solution goes into the world is also fair. So I will just extend to Lucas' points that building teams that way, which have this entire focus.
Yes.
And then further sensitizing will work. Obviously, the techie is also educated in a way that he's sensitive to that person coming in the team and saying that is all education can do. But it must be somebody's agenda.
Right.
That
Absolutely. We are actually out of time, but there's a very quick last question that I'd like to pose to both of you, and which is that is there a possibility of democratizing this process? In the sense that we've been looking at problems and solutions within the limited community of the tech world and the developer community, and we say, all right, we build appropriately skilled teams, we bring in external, we bring in other sensitivities and viewpoints into the team so that the solutions are structured properly. But how about, is there a scope for a larger participation in this in terms of sort of public debate, public participation, a democratic approach to this problem solving? Just a quick answer.
In my opinion, yes. In my experience, I always found that the problems that we look for solving actually, most probably, have been solved also elsewhere. Most often, we are solving problems that humanity has already solved. We are just too focused on our, narrow mindset, narrow problems, narrow environment. We should look more openly. So democratizing is the right way.
Thank you. Nikhil?
So you said democratizing is the way. One way is Linux Foundation and large open source organizations. They control a lot of power on developers. Like today, Linus Torvalds, we all kind of treat him like God, honestly speaking. A lot of respect for him. And for a very long period of time, he used to enforce the quality of code, the structure that can come in, that is accepted. He's still doing that. But then people started poking at and not properly submitted drivers are still pushed into the system. Now, if at that level, when you submit something, because a lot of work is still a derivative of open source, a lot, whole lot is open source. At that point, if you enforce that, I will also have somebody checking for the fairness. Then, the point that you're saying, Srinivasan, that comes in. That is where I can see that you can have a meet. Because in the corporate rooms also, much of it is a derivative of the open source. What is built is what people start using it and then building on top of it. So at this point, I see some hope that these foundations are very ethical people, also very good people. If it starts from there, they hold a lot of power on a lot of people. So I think that is one area apart from the media and the leadership, political leadership, obviously. But this is another one.
I think that's a fantastic point, Nikhil. I think open source development of fairness, and a bias checkers in the system. I think that's a fantastic idea to take forward. Thank you so much for sparing the time and joining us today. It's been really wonderful talking to you both, and I personally have learned a lot. I'm sure that our audience has taken away many, many points to think over. Thank you once again.